Mark did a wonderful job this morning, Stan,
And she's
on our service.
He did.
Yep.
He did. He did.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, he's carrying on the family tradition, you know.
Right.
He's doing a good job. We're proud of
Yeah.
him.
Well, we learned it, Emmanuel.
He's got a nice daughter. We're proud. I mean, well, he's got a nice sister that we're proud of, too. But, unfortunately, she's not here.
She doesn't live here.
Yeah.
Hi, David and Nathan.
Dan, I don't see your smiling face. Where are you hiding?
Hi.
I don't know if there's other people in your room, but I see the two of you guys.
Who is
I
that?
don't know.
That's David Silva. That's David and Nathan.
Listen,
If that's the who is that you're asking about.
yes,
We can all hear
that
you,
is who he
Stan.
was asking you.
Already Ellen, Larry Sandler.
All right, and it looks like we're getting a few more people, and then we can go ahead and start because I wouldn't want to disappoint Rabbi Berkson, who likes to start right on time.
It's my German reform side.
Fun. I got that too.
I have that.
Got it more directly than I did.
I got that from being a lawyer that we had to start on time and the judges got upset.
Well, in my case, in my line of work, it's a different judge.
Yeah.
All
Hello,
right.
Mr. Levine.
Hello there. I sent you a voicemail.
I haven't looked at my phone today.
Okay, you should look at it because it's a very important message.
Oh,
Oh,
Alan, judging by the chair you're sitting in, you were supposed to be in our breakout group last night during Seder, and we just got an empty chair. We missed you.
I was there for most of the time, and then I had silent.
That's what
prayer.
they all say.
It's really okay.
Margie.
Hi, Margie.
Hi. See the vase that
Hi,
we used
Jean.
last night?
I did. Thank you.
We love
Hi,
it.
George.
Thank you.
Hi, Georgie.
I
Are you up, George?
Susan, I'm trying to see your hat.
Shana Tova.
Fancy.
It's your kippah. It's not a hat.
Right. Sure it is. That is quite a kippah. So, Shana Tova, it's good to see everybody. I think I don't even have to introduce myself. I know everybody in this group. We're good. So, my first question, and this is an important question, is do you have a copy of the text in front of you or near you? You can shake your head no if you don't, or hold it up if you do. Right, it's definitely in the Machzor, if you have that. If there's anybody who doesn't, raise your hand so I know, and I'll put it on the screen. If everybody has it,
Okay.
you don't have it?
No.
You
Oh,
want
okay.
tell us what page
We
it's
can
on,
get it in a minute.
Rabbi?
Yeah, the Torah text.
We'll get it. I'll get it.
Oh, okay.
We'll get
The
it.
Torah
We have
portion
it.
text is on page 238 if you're in the Machzor.
238.
If you have a different translation, that's totally fine. We know that from Study Minion. We have no problem with a multiplicity of translations. I have like 4 different copies of the text in front of me right now. I'll focus on one at a time. So the Torah portion's on 238 in the Machzor. If you're in the Plaut Chumash, it's on 132. If you have a different copy, you're on your own. If you want me to put it up on the screen, please tell me. I'm happy to. But if not,
do it because there may be some other people that might show up
I
as
know.
you go through.
My hesitation is that then we can't see each other's faces. So I'm thinking if everybody oh, Sherilyn, you want me to put it up? I can.
Can make a difference.
Whatever, you decide.
If everybody who's here has a copy, I'm sort of happy to leave it that way so that we can all see each other's faces and interact that way.
Okay.
let's go with that. If it becomes a problem, let me know and I can always put it up there. I have it on slides. It's just then we can't see each other. Okay, so let me, as sort of a prelude to all of this, a couple of things. One is, if you have a lot of background noise, mute yourself. We've all been on Zoom for a lot of months now, and we know how it works. Also, on the flip side, if you have something to add, I really, really, really want this to be a discussion. Nobody wants to listen to me for an hour, especially me. So please unmute yourself and jump in if you have something to say, or raise your hand, or indicate in the chat that you have something to say. Any of those ways will get my attention. And if not, somebody else will get my attention. No problem. And there was something else I was going to say, right? Oh, the other thing I was going to say is, I know a lot of people in this group are Saturday morning study minion regulars. And the goal is not, my goal is not to do a line by line discussion as we would in study minion, because I was given the task of let's discuss the whole Torah portion and Haftarah. And since we do not have the time to sit here from now until next Rosh Hashanah, we are not going to go line by line, which is about how long it would take to do 2 full, really great stories a line at a time. So we're looking bigger picture than Saturday morning normally. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. If you have, thank you, Susan. Okay. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. Let's at least start with the Torah portion, and let's go ahead and read it aloud. Would somebody like to read? Like I said, you don't have to listen to me for the hour. Would somebody like to read, starting with the beginning of the Torah portion, Genesis 21:1, up through 21, up through verse 5 for starters?
I can do it.
Alan.
And Adonai remembered Sarah as promised, and that which had been spoken, Adonai fulfilled for Sarah. And Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time that God had told him. And Abraham called his son, the one born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, by the name Isaac. He will laugh. And Abraham circumcised Isaac, his son, at the age of 8 days, as God had commanded him. And Abraham's age was 100 years when Isaac, his son, was born to him.
Thank you. All right. That was 5, right? Yes. Okay. So just so we know where we're coming from, right before this, the end of chapter 20, where the story picks up before this portion, is Sarah has just been essentially a slave. She was sort of taken into the king's palace. And one of the versions of the wife-sister narrative, where basically Abraham was asked, is she your sister? And he said, oh, yeah, she's my sister, because he didn't want to be killed so that the king would take her. So she was taken into the king's palace. And then God performs miracles, essentially, and reveals that, in fact, she's Abraham's wife, and she is freed back to her husband. All right. And then God remembers Sarah, and we pick up with this portion. Okay. So that's sort of the background of where we are. Ishmael has already been born. Remember that Ishmael is about 14 years older than Isaac. Okay. 13 when Isaac is conceived, 14 when Isaac is born, approximately. All right. So that's where we are at the beginning of this story. Now, do those first 5 verses or so give anybody reason why we read this? One of the reasons, there are lots of reasons that we read this on Rosh Hashanah. Jean.
The rebirth type thing, or a birth.
Okay.
Beginning of
So like,
a new era.
all right, new era, birth, rebirth, absolutely. Anything else? Other thoughts? Dan, you're on mute.
God fulfilling a promise. God's fulfilled promise.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the big ones that is also often pointed to is God fulfills this promise, right? Isn't what this holiday is all about, that God should remember us and do as we are praying and as we are hoping and working to make happen, so God should do for us. And so the fact that this portion opens, the very opening verses, and God remembered Sarah as promised, and that which had been spoken, God fulfilled for her, right? So right from the beginning, God is following through, and it's almost wishful thinking that just like God does this for Sarah, God will do that for us, right? George.
It also deals with God's role as creator. In other words, God was instrumental in Sarah getting pregnant. And so just as God was also instrumental in creating human beings back on, what was it, the sixth day, I believe it was, in create. So God has this role in creation of not only the world, because again, it's the parallel. In Rosh Hashanah, God is the creator of the world. And so it's also God is the creator of human beings.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So we talk about creation, and I know in Gates of Repentance, our earlier version of the Machzor, one of the Torah portions that many congregations read on Rosh Hashanah was creation of the world, right? Because Rosh Hashanah is also a commemoration of, it's the birthday of the world. It's which Susan's party hat reminds us. It's a reminder that this is when God created the world. And so, yes, here is God creating again. So why else is it important, this before I jump there, Susan has something to add. But you're on mute, and we would learn much more if you unmute.
I'm not sure about that, but okay. So my answer to your question, besides the beautiful answers that were given so far, I love this, and it's a part of this is in a talit where I have lots of different words of Torah that I love on it. And I love it because this is the first laughter we find in the Bible.
Yes.
The part of Rosh Hashanah is the joy.
Yes, absolutely. So we are about to get to the laughter part, and then that's great transition, Susan. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Would somebody like to read for us verses?
Wait, I have a question though. Excuse me, please. I'm sorry.
Sure.
But didn't we also hear about laughter when the angels come and talk? So maybe, with all due respect, Susan, maybe this is the second time we hear about laughter, when Sarah laughed when the angels came. Am I remembering that? With all due respect, I don't mean.
It's how the name came about is because of the other, so they go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Nope, that's totally fine. That's the whole idea here. It's a discussion, it's a conversation. So would somebody like to read verses 6, 7, 8? 6, well, really, let's do 6 and 7 for right now. Nadine. But unmute first. Okay, you
Yep.
did.
We did. And excuse me. And Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and who will hear will laugh on my account. And she said, who would have told Abraham, Sarah will nurse children? And yet I have given him a son in his old age.
All right. And let's stop there for the moment. I know I said we're not going to go verse by verse, but we're going to, we'll get there. We're already going faster. This is already a week of study minion we've done.
2 months.
I know, right? 6, 7 verses. All right. So yes, just like Susan said, we're talking about laughter, right? God has brought me laughter. Isaac's name itself, Yitzchak, is about it's connected to the same root as the word for laughter. So it's in here it says he will laugh. It's, so it's about laughing. But what's fascinating is the wording here, right? So God has brought me laughter, but the Hebrew is kind of weird. Actually, if anybody, I realize you're probably not today, and that's okay. If anybody was looking at the altar, the altar's commentary actually says, laughter has God made me. And he points out that it's kind of like Yoda. It's ambiguous. It doesn't make that much sense. Like it's a really weirdly constructed sentence in Hebrew. They cleaned it up in our Machzor and made it make more sense, but the original, it doesn't. It's this very odd grammatical construction. We don't really know who's laughing or why, right? Is it Sarah laughing? Is it Isaac? Is it Abraham? Is it God? Is it everybody else? Right? And then there's also the second part of that in verse 7, I have given him a son in his old age. That's because Sarah's the young one in this relationship. She is 90.
That's why the laughter is there, because of their ages.
Yeah, absolutely. He's 100. She's 90. So it's his old age. Obviously, nobody's surprised that Sarah at 90 is having a child. Jean.
I'm just, there's got to be a way that somebody that the rabbis in studying this have said, okay, the 100 years really means something, because I have trouble believing that Sarah would be 90 years old and appeal to the Pharaoh. But so, I'm just thinking that the ages are really a way off.
Even if that's so, though, that we know today that there are people who can have children at what we believe are older ages in the 50s and 60s. We've seen that. However, I would also be, I can understand the laughter knowing how difficult it is to take care of kids at those ages.
Well, this doesn't have to be logic, at this particular point. This is a miracle of God.
Absolutely.
Naturally, people at that time weren't expected to live to be 90 and 100 years old to begin with. Here they are. Sarah conceived. He was fertile, by the way. I mean, the whole thing smacks of a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Or the work of God.
Absolutely. And as many other scholars have pointed out, the fact that Sarah was barren and then it was God who enabled her to have this child is a lot of things. One of the things that I'll point out about it is that, remember, in chapter 20, she was in this foreign king in Abimelech's palace, right? And so the fact that we know, and it's a big deal, that she couldn't have children until this point is really important to our story, because it makes sure that we as readers know Isaac is Abraham's child. There is no chance that there was any funny business or that this is somehow not actually it. Nope. Because God didn't open her womb until this point. So that's important to our story, obviously, as the Torah establishes a family line. We have to know that it's the right family. Dan, and then George.
Is it conceivable here also that God is making an effort to bring Sarah back from the palace from Melech, and it's almost teshuvah, a returning of Sarah and Abraham to God and the faith?
I love that. Absolutely. Of course that's possible. I love that interpretation. Thank you.
I like to play on words, conceivable.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Highly unintentional, but George.
point to, it says in the text specifically in the first several, and that Abraham circumcised Isaac, his son, and it says that. So again, to what you said about making sure we know the familial relationship. The question I have is, after a child is sometimes adopted, shall we say, then does the wife, the mother, normally conceive? Is there some kind of either psychological or medical reason why after a child is adopted that the allegedly barren wife conceives? Is there a psychological or medical reason for that?
I am neither a doctor nor a psychiatrist.
Are you asking, George, if it's possible or that it's more common after an adoption that a woman conceives?
Yes.
There's some, having worked in fertility medicine for over 10 years,
great.
I would sometimes see this, and I think a lot of it is, it's just like people will go through IVF multiple times and then decide, oh, well, we'll adopt, and then they conceive. It's possible that just not having the stress of trying to conceive may be contributing to the issue. It's not really known for sure. I mean, technically, anybody could conceive, I suppose. I know that most people can conceive unless they have no eggs there. So.
Right. Thank you, Jean. And I saw another hand. Steve, is that? Are you?
Yes. Thank you. Nice to meet all of you in a weird way. So, this is obviously a very dark story, and I think is the first hint of darkness, because it's a strange, that word laughter. There's also, they're laughing at Sarah and Abraham. Mm-hmm. Look how old these guys are. How silly. It's almost mockery.
Yeah.
I don't think the story is dark.
You what?
I don't think the story is dark.
I think parts of it are certainly dark. I mean, we're going to get there. The story gets darker. Yeah. Right now we have a feast. We have laughter. We have excitement. We have the celebration of this brand new baby, right? He grew up. He was weaned. Abraham prepared a great feast on the day of Isaac's weaning. Now it gets dark, right? Starting in verse 9, we take a turn. So thank you, Steve, for your transition. This is great. All right. Would somebody like to read us starting with verse 9 through?
How about 8? We didn't read. Well,
I just read 8. I just summarized 8. We're good. So let's read verses 9 through 13. Somebody like to volunteer? Sherry.
Now Sarah saw the Egyptian Hagar's son, the one she bore to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, "Expel this servant woman and her son, for the son of this servant woman will not share the inheritance with my son, not with Isaac." In Abraham's eyes, this seemed wrong, for it concerned his son. And God said to Abraham, "Do not see this as a wrong act against the boy and your servant woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall go forth. I will make the servant woman's son a nation as well, for he is your seed."
Thank you. All right. So a couple of things. Like I said, our Machzor cleans up the English very nicely. Everywhere it says servant woman is a little ambiguous or not in the Hebrew. It's a slave. So let's call a spade a spade. Hagar is not a servant, she's a slave. Besides that, do you notice anything about the conversation here in these, or the wording in these verses that Sherry just read for us? Sherry?
I for the first time that I can recall, it's the woman that God says you have to follow her word whereas normally the men have the power in the Torah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is definitely a sort of flipping of our expectations, which, by the way, if you look in the chat, Peter wrote some very brilliant words in chat, not surprisingly, that a major theme of this part of Genesis is the subversion of expectations. Abraham and Sarah aren't siblings. As the king believes, Sarah doesn't expect to have a child.
Yes.
And through divine intervention, the expectations continue to be turned over. And I think that this gender thing is another place where we turn our expectations upside down a little bit. Absolutely. Larry and William, did you guys have something to add? But you have to unmute.
Okay. Yeah. I noticed in the earlier verse, Sarah said, "All who hear will laugh on my account," and then Hagar laughs, and he wants her kicked out. So it seems like there's a difference between laughing with her and laughing at her.
Ah, good point. Absolutely. Absolutely. George?
We have a dysfunctional relationship. Hagar is not only the servant to Sarah, she is the wife of Abraham. Because once they have had a sexual relationship together, they are, at least at those times, married.
Sort of. Except that we see throughout the Torah that yes and no, that there's sort of this concubine relationship where no, you're not a full wife. There is a difference, right? We see that also with Jacob, who has Leah and Rachel, and Bilhah and Zilpah, right? Like it isn't the same. It is, yes, it elevates her status, which we see in a previous chapter Sarah doesn't like already when Ishmael is born, but it doesn't make her on an equal plane with his actual wife.
Well, she may be a second wife. She may be the status of a second wife as opposed to a primary wife.
It's still not a wife status. It's still not quite there. But I also want to point out, Hagar has been Sarah's slave for years, a lot of years, right? Ishmael, like I said, Ishmael is already he's a teenager by now. So Hagar has been Sarah's slave for a very long time. Presumably, they have some kind of close relationship, whatever it is, or did. Presumably, they refer to each other by name, except if you look at this passage, she doesn't. All of a sudden here, Sarah completely dehumanizes both Hagar and Ishmael. Expel this servant woman or this slave and her son. The son of this slave will not share with my son, not with Isaac, right? It's like, it's yucky. Best word I can think of right now. It's yucky. Like that feeling of that woman, not even woman, that slave. I don't want her here. Right? And I find that really striking and really remarkable that she just dehumanizes them and kind of pushes them down even more. And then God echoes her language, by the way. If you look at verse 13, God does the same thing. He doesn't refer to Hagar and Ishmael. He also refers to the servant or the slave's son, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
Stan, wait, hold on. Stan and then Shirley.
Interesting what you say, Rabbi. But Hagar was really a servant, and apparently, in that society, it was like a caste system where people were ranking based upon their relationships, upon their occupations, and so on. And of course, that condition even existed in the 20th century into India. So it has a heritage, I guess, here.
Absolutely, but they still have names. All right,
Yes,
Shirling and then
do.
Larry.
I thought in the earlier chapter, actually Hagar all of a sudden feel like, now I have a son, and he was kind of pressing Sarah. And this is Sarah times to revenge, or like finally, hey, that's why he was laughing. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, in an earlier chapter, we do see that once Hagar gets pregnant, quickly, we might add, once Hagar is pregnant, she is not so nice to Sarah. Absolutely, that does happen. It's, again, though, it's been 13 more years. It's been a long time. Ishmael is 13 or 14 at this point. So it's been a while. The fact that she's still there, I think, speaks volumes to that relationship, and that maybe it got better again after Ishmael was born. We don't really know. We don't have all of those details. But the fact that she just refers to their shared, I mean, to Abraham, who they share in various, their shared head of household. Let's call him that. That slave woman, right? Like that's the part that is rubbing me the wrong way a little bit. All right, Larry, I see your hand up as well.
Yes, I want to point out the language here. The son of this servant woman will not share the inheritance with my son, not with Isaac. And it seems that the stress there is on sharing the inheritance, and that once the question of inheritance and legacy comes into it, then the relationship changes.
Absolutely. So sadly, it goes back to money and land and power and all of those things. And yes, definitely. All right, I want to keep going. I see you, George.
Okay,
do you have a quick thing? Go ahead.
I think that it's important to notice that Hagar is of Egyptian royalty. And so you have Egyptian and slave. And again, I see this as perhaps a foreshadowing of what's going to be coming later when the Israelites are enslaved to the Egyptians. So I see that as a parallel there.
Absolutely. We also have, we also have the fact that Sarah was just in Abimelech's palace, right? Like she was just having her own experience of slavery or something like it, right? And so you would think that maybe she'd have a little more empathy here, and it is sorely lacking in that sense. All right, I want to keep going because we have a lot of text, and I want to make sure we at least get to talk a little about the Haftarah as well. So let's keep going here. We could, like I said, we could be on these stories for a long time. There's a lot in them. Okay. So does somebody want to read for us verses 14 through 17? Dean, go ahead.
Okay, so Abraham awoke early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water to give to Hagar, placed them on her shoulder along with the boy, and sent her off. She walked and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the water skin was empty, am I past where you want? Oh,
no, you can keep going.
The 17. And when the water skin was empty, she cast the boy under one of the bushes and went and sat down at a distance as far as the shot of a bow, for she said, "Let me not see the child die." And she sat at a distance and raised her voice and cried.
All right, thank you. That's good. All right, and so I want to just throw out there, remember those words, Abraham awoke early in the morning, Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. Remember those words if you're coming back to tomorrow's Torah study with Rabbi Rassoff in the afternoon, because you will hear them again. Because when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, they also do the exact same thing by Yashkem Baboker. They get up early in the morning to start their journey. Okay, so that's That's a thing we see in Torah sometimes. And really that's all it means is they got up early, which you would assume if you have a long journey ahead, you would get up early. But we also see over and over and over in our texts that it's an indication of eagerness to some extent as well. That it shows that you are like up and ready to do it. Think of the way that kids get up on the first day of school, right? Vayashkem baboker, like they are up and they are dressed quickly for like, you know, or if a principal is, no kids are ever late on the first day of school, usually. Sometimes, right? Everybody is up and ready and dressed and there. But by week 3, Vayashkem baboker is not a thing anymore. There's a lot of whining when the alarm goes off. Maybe that's just my house, right? There's a lot of like, but I don't wanna. And then the late students dribble in because somehow the thing you were so excited about, you're not quite as excited anymore when it's however many days in, like 3 or 33 or whatever it is, right? So this getting up early shows a certain amount of excitement and eagerness and willingness to do the thing. So Abraham getting up early to expel or to kick out Hagar and Ishmael is a big deal, but just keep that sort of tucked away in the back of your mind when you talk about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac tomorrow, okay? I skipped over the part of how the boys were playing, but that's okay. There's a lot there, but all right, for any thoughts on these verses right here?
Everything makes it sound like her son Ishmael is much younger, that she's put on his shoulder, that she casts him under a bush, and just
He's
it's not like he's a lot younger.
Yes, like there's question of, is she actually like picking him up, right? It almost sounds like it.
Yeah.
Like, the bread and a skin of water and place them on her shoulder along with the boy, right? It sounds like she's literally carrying a child on her shoulders. But again, Ishmael was 13 when Isaac was conceived, right? Isaac is not only born, but has been weaned, which depending on which commentator you're reading, means it's been like he's at least 1, 2, 3 years old. So Ishmael is comfortably a teenager. I don't see him as being on her shoulders.
Right.
But you're right. The text makes it sound that way. It's like, it's a little weird, and they refer to him as a boy. But again, if you look the internal timeline, he's not really a boy. He's a teenager. So it's a funny internal logic consistency. Ben and then Stan.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say it's a great point because it does read like he's a baby. And the same thing that she casts him under the bush as opposed to the 13, 14-year-old boy. It almost makes me wonder, even though it's not said, is he somehow bound? Does he have to be bound to be taken away like this?
I don't think it says bound.
No, it doesn't say bound, but it makes me kind of wonder as an unspoken between the lines kind of thing. Did he have
that's
to
an
be
interesting
somehow
question. I have never heard that.
Dragged away?
I've never heard that. I haven't heard that, but it's an interesting question because you would think like a 16-year-old wouldn't willingly just walk out into the wilderness with, a skin of water and a crust of bread or a piece of bread.
Or being that early, could he still be sleepy?
As a teenager? That is also an excellent point. I like that, Sherry. Stan, did you have something to add as well?
Yes. There must have been let me start with this. Hagar was a slave woman to Sarah, but she was something more than that to Abraham. He was the father of her child. And apparently, he felt a very strong sense of responsibility. And so there was a relationship not only of parent to child, but of well, I can't say husband to wife, but certainly a strong feeling of responsibility. As the mother of his child, he would feel that.
And to his own child, right? He has sent his own child out into the wilderness.
Absolutely.
And obviously that's a big deal.
You bet.
Right? So, yes.
For any father.
I didn't know I said to follow Sarah.
Okay.
They would watch over them regardless.
Mm-hmm. All right. Does somebody want to read for us 17 through 21? We'll go to the end of the story. Nobody wants. Oh, Norm.
And God heard the boy's voice, and a messenger of God called out to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy's voice where he is. Stand up, lift the boy, and hold strongly onto him with your hand, for I will make of him a great nation." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and she filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew. He made his home in the wilderness and became a shooter of the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother acquired for him a wife from the land of Egypt.
Thank you. All right. So I have to say right off the bat, the most striking thing to me is that Hagar is crying and God hears Ishmael's voice. So we had just taken all these steps where God was saying, listen to your wife, listen to the woman in the story. And then literally the woman is crying and he hears the boy. Okay. So we have, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. Okay, fine. Jean.
Well, this is the second time in the page where he says, "I will make of him a great nation," also, because he said on it, or at least of a nation.
Predicting.
Yeah, and it almost foresees the conflict between Arab and Jew.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, absolutely, it does. But you're right that first God tells Abraham, "I will make the servant woman's son a nation because he's yours." And then God tells Hagar, "I will make your son a great nation." Absolutely. Larry.
I was just going to make that same point, but also to note that for Ishmael, it's sort of a consolation prize, that Isaac is the founder of the chosen people, the first great nation, and then Ishmael, you're going to be a great nation also. And this idea of the secondary position and the consolation prize, I think also foreshadows the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Absolutely. We also have this well, right? We also have this well that God opens her eyes and she sees a well.
Question.
Which also not the last time we'll see the well, right? We learn that Miriam had a well that Midrash tells us followed the Israelites through the wilderness and gave when we left Egypt many generations later, right? And according to Midrash, it's the same well. It was Hagar's well and it showed up, and then it disappeared for a while, and it was Miriam's well, and it is this mythical, amazing well that shows up when the Israelites are in need. So I think that's fascinating, again, because we have this woman who is not Jewish, who was the slave, who gets this miracle for her. Okay. And Peter also wants to point out in the chat that Hagar's Egyptianness is brought up. with this marriage, with Ishmael's eventual marriage. Absolutely. Hagar's actual name, Hagar, essentially the stranger, right, is one way to interpret her name. So yes, absolutely. She is constantly put as sort of an opposite, a foil. She and Ishmael are often put in the place of kind of a foil for Sarah and Isaac. Absolutely. Stan.
Question, Rabbi. Is God acting towards Hagar? Is he responding to Hagar's plea, or is he responding because of his relationship with Abraham, and is responding to Abraham's feeling?
Good question.
Or both?
I'm gonna guess both, because God has already reassured Abraham that he will make that God will make Ishmael the founder of, or the father of a nation as well. So that's already God's plan, right? But also it does say God heard the boy's voice, but God heard the voice. So God heard them crying in the wilderness and responded to that, right? So it kind of goes both ways. It's that very interesting idea, very Rosh Hashanah appropriate, I might add, that we both have to rely on God, right? Because God already has this plan to make Ishmael a great nation, but also that God needed to hear their voice. If Hagar and Ishmael hadn't cried out, what might have happened? We don't know. So I think it's a really interesting way to think about it, that it takes both. It takes God's plan and God's power, but it also takes us calling out and making an effort and trying to do something. We can't just sit back and put our feet up and say, God's in charge. God's got this. I don't have to do anything. Right?
Thank you.
All right, Margie. You got to unmute yourself, Margie. We want to hear you.
Not necessarily. I may have missed it, but I think that Sarah always refers to Isaac as her son. She never refers to him as our son, Abraham's and my son. It's her son. I don't think that's coincidental.
It goes back and forth a little bit, because even here, if you look at verse 7, it says, I have given him a son in his old age. So maybe he was crying then and she wanted to blame Abraham for it. But, it does go both ways, at least sometimes. But you're right. But we often hear my son. You're totally right. Dan.
It surprises me that God would decide that even though Ishmael is half Jewish, he's going to consent, basically, or steer, having walked with him his whole life, to marry Egyptian. It's almost like he's creating the conflict that's going to later occur, and even the foretelling of enslavement of the Israeli or the Jewish people. The other thing that's interesting here is we speak of Ishmael and Isaac coming from Sarah and Hagar, and because it's always the mother who determines whether a child is Jewish, is that where this comes from in the Torah?
Not exactly, kind of. So, no. The real reason that traditionally it's matrilineal, that it comes from the mother, is because as Judaism, as Jews, went through lots and lots of conflict, quite frankly, it is easier to determine with certainty who the mother is than it is who the father is. So,
of course,
therefore, so from a practical perspective, you have to rely on one rather than the other, especially in a people who have seen our fair share, more than our fair share, of warfare and conflict, where it might not have always been clear. So that's where the matrilineal, like the practical side of it. The other practical side of it, I guess, is also that many would say that because
Others
the
are much more
traditional gender
attentive to the
roles
child.
have the
Yeah.
mother
You
kind
can
of more in
see a
charge of the home
relationship.
life, that it might have been that's where traditions would have been passed down from. Now, that said, that's also somewhat modern, because if you look at like even Talmudic texts, it's the men who are in the academy doing all the studying and bringing home all the tradition. So, and if you look at the biblical text, Abraham was Jewish.
Mhm.
Abraham married Sarah. Sarah wasn't necessarily at the begin, like we see all of the women kind of coming from more outside the family and being brought in. So initially it's kind of patrilineal because it goes through the patriarchs. So it's a little bit of lot of things, but I think ultimately the practicality was what won that out. And then the reform movement said lots of other things, like it's fine. One Jewish parent raised the child Jewish. We don't care which parent it is.
Mhm.
George.
I'm looking at the text in verse 17. The translation is, "And God heard the boy's voice." And in the Hebrew it says hana'ar. So it's not even a yeled, he's a na'ar, which is I think even a lower step. But where
No,
in
it's
the
higher.
text
It's a higher step.
has-
Na'ar is like a youth. It's like it's older than a yeled
Okay.
usually.
But where in the text we see that Hagar cried out because of the situation, but where is it that God heard the boy's voice? And then the messenger of God, call it, responds to Hagar. I see a disconnect, perhaps.
Well, that's what I said, that we hear Hagar is the one crying, right? In verse 16, Hagar is the one crying.
Right, but
Tisa
where does it
et
say
Korah?
God heard the boy's voice?
You read it to
17.
us. You read it in verse 17. Vayishma Elohim, God heard et kol hana'ar, the voice of the boy.
Well, where does we see in the text that he cried out?
We don't. That's what I said at the beginning of this section.
Oh, then
That's what I said.
I'm sorry.
We didn't hear the boy cry out. We only heard Hagar cry out, and God responded to Ishmael's.
Okay, I missed that. I'm sorry.
Because gender. Lila.
You just mentioned before something about patrilineal society.
Oh yeah, it's going to take us way off track.
I'm going to take you way off because it's something that occurred to me, and I'd like, perhaps we can talk about it in a minute. Then how is it now where the Jewish identity of a child is connected to the Jewish mother?
Okay, so traditionally speaking, it goes through post-Torah. Torah is its own ball of everything. Torah is its own sort of enclosed situation, because the rules that many Jews now live by were codified in the Talmud. Like that's where they were discussed, written down. That's what we have. So from Talmudic times on, it was matrilineal through the mother because of all of the things we said. The reform movement came along and said, we treat men and women equally. We give aliyot to women as well as men. We count women in a minyan as well as men. We have families that don't have a mother and a father. They might have a mother or a father. They might have two mothers. They might have two fathers. So why are we using this old gendered lens to look at family? And so the reform movement ruled that patrilineal descent was fine, that essentially we go with as long as a parent is Jewish, a guardian, probably I would even go so far as to say is Jewish, and they are raising the child Jewishly, great. We believe that that child is Jewish.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, I know again that we could discuss the details of this text for hours, days even, and I want to make sure we've at least peeked at the Haftarah. So I think everybody's in a machzor, so turn to page 250. We are not going to read the whole thing. It is twice as long as the Torah portion that we've been discussing for the last 54 minutes. So with our 6 remaining minutes, first I'm gonna give you a summary of this portion. I'm guessing a lot of us know it, or at least have a passing familiarity with it. Okay, so okay, so Elkanah has 2 wives, Penina and Hannah. Penina has children, Hannah doesn't. Okay, they would go up, they would worship. Penina was mean to Hannah because Hannah had no kids from their shared husband. All right, Hannah went and prayed to God to give her children, or even sons, to give her sons is usually what they pray for. But she prays. The priest, Eli, sees her praying and basically says, "What are you, drunk? Get out of here." And she said, literally, that's what the text says. Margie's laughing, but that's literally what he says, I'm sorry. "How long will you persist in drunkenness? Put away your wine, get rid of it." And she says, no, I'm not drunk. I'm praying. I'm just pouring out my heart, from which we learn that she is praying silently, but her lips are moving, right? So just like what everybody looks like when you're trying to teach us something, but you forget to unmute, that's what Hannah looked like to Eli. He accuses her, instead of being muted, he accuses her of being drunk. So Eli says, "I'm so sorry. Whatever you are praying for, may God grant it for you." And she goes home, and lo and behold, she gets pregnant. And she basically says, "I will give this child to God if I can have one." Right? So she dedicates her child to temple service. If she can get pregnant, she does. She has this child. She keeps him with her until he is a little bit older, and then takes him back and basically dedicates him into temple service. And that's the story, more or less. It ends with this fascinating blessing at the end, but it's long. Okay. So why, the big question, the overarching question is, why is this the Haftarah that we read, both with the Torah portion we just discussed and on Rosh Hashanah? Dan.
For the same reasons. We're talking about a woman praying to God and asking for a child, and he blesses her with a child, just like he did Sarah. So there's a similarity between even though we're in different books, all the elements are the same. So
yes, absolutely.
The reasons are the same, without stating them, without restating.
Okay. Great.
Can I add one sentence? Ultimately, God is the life giver.
Yes, absolutely. God's giving life. God's answering prayers. These are all wonderful things for Rosh Hashanah. Sherry, and then Larry.
I think part of it is that Hannah feels an obligation then to, since the promise from God was fulfilled, she will fulfill her promise to God.
Ah, yes. Love that. In the same way that we were talking about Hagar and Ishmael, that they have to take some positive action to fulfill God's promise, basically. That same thing here, that it goes both ways. It's not a one-way thing. Absolutely. Larry. Larry, you are on mute.
Hi. 2 things. One is that there's a parallel between the rival wives, one of whom can't have a kid and eventually does through God's intervention, the other who has a kid and is, teasing her about it. taunting her about it. And then the other thing is that in both cases where the woman has a child through God's intervention, he goes on to do great things.
Absolutely. Great. I saw Stan and I saw George. So Stan?
Yes. I think what we're witnessing here is the birth of a nation, the very beginning.
Yep.
Bereshit.
Right, which again goes back to the fact that Bereshit was our Rosh Hashanah Torah portion for many, many years in the Reform movement, or one of them.